Thank you very much for the opportunity to present to you this afternoon. Again, my name is Robert Jones. I'm an environmental researcher and an environmental consultant, and I'd like to say I should get the award for the furthest distance traveled to this conference from South Africa, but I have to confess, I actually do live in the U.S. at the moment. I'm going to talk about some research that I did over the last 4 years in South Africa while I lived there, but we recently moved back to the U.S. And what I'm going to talk to you about tonight, this afternoon, is some research that I did there, which I call a trail of tears, and it's really dealing with the environmental asbestos contamination in South Africa. I call it Libby times 40, and the reason that I say that is because what I found there is really very analogous to the situations in Libby, Montana, which we all know something about and have heard quite a bit about even today. I'm just going to present to you very briefly the background for this research and the work that I was doing there, what the goals were of the work and some of our findings, what the communities are that are at risk to environmental asbestos exposure, and then maybe some ideas about what we should be doing next and how that might tie back from the lessons learned in Libby, Montana. By way of brief background, I went to South Africa really for the purpose of working on a PhD. My wife called it a midlife crisis, but we sold our home in Maryland, where I lived and worked for a long time, doing some asbestos work as well. And we moved to South Africa with the goal of doing some PhD work. And you know, it is a small world in many respects. I didn't know that just down the road lived one of the premier experts in asbestos issues, Barry Castleman, when I lived in Maryland. I had to move to Africa to find out that I should have been talking to him. And never doubt that a single person can't get something started, because Barry went to South Africa in 1983, I think it was, to talk about issues of asbestos contamination, which this is during the apartheid government, and he was probably not a very popular person, at least in certain circles, while there speaking about these things. It hadn't been talked about, and it unfortunately did not get talked about a lot after that, unfortunately. But he actually planted a seed in a young researcher's mind, and she went out and did some of the first environmental exposure monitoring to asbestos in South Africa. Actually, some of the first work done really anywhere related to that. Marianne Felix, she worked on a dissertation dealing with that topic, thanks to the work that Barry did by going there and just planting that seed. I then kind of followed a little bit in her footsteps, though, a few years later, to take that study to the next step and do a much broader, more comprehensive assessment of South Africa, specifically the areas where asbestos had been mined. And we talked a little bit today about the amphibole asbestos and the chrysotile asbestos, the serpentine. South Africa is blessed with mineral resources. We know about the gold and the diamonds and the platinum and the coal and other things that are mined there, but of course they're also cursed with mineral resources such as asbestos. And they mined all three commercial varieties of asbestos in South Africa: chrysotolite, amosite, which is actually an acronym for Asbestos Mines of South Africa. The world supply of amosite came from this area of South Africa, mostly in this area around Penge, a little bit more from the Northern Cape. And all of this area was chrysotolite mining, so it was all amphibole mining, as well as all of this region. And then near Barberton and the Swaziland border, this is Swaziland here, there was chrysotile mining. So they mined all three commercial varieties starting in 1893 all the way up till about 2001. I think the last mine closed, the Mazuli chrysotile mine. And each of these red dots you see there basically represents the location of a mine site in South Africa that became the target of my investigations. I was essentially asked by the Department of Environmental Affairs and Tourism in South Africa, it's their version of our EPA, if you will, to go out and look at what might be the levels of contamination in South Africa as a result of the mining of asbestos, specifically in the communities, because very little work had been done in that regard, and it was certainly an area that I was very interested in looking at. So they specifically asked me to do those things to determine the levels of pollution, conduct at least a preliminary risk assessment as to what that may mean from an exposure standpoint, and in doing that, we surveyed all of the communities nominally within 2 to 5 kilometers of these red dots here. That's actually a 5-kilometer buffer, so that gives you a range of the area that we were looking at and covering. And that's actually quite a large area. Just that 5-kilometer buffer is about 7,000 square kilometers. So it's It's an area of the size of a small state to actually try to cover. And then we developed some risk assessment models on how to go back and target those communities for further work. As I mentioned, we looked at communities within 5 kilometers, sometimes a little further than that, sometimes closer. Tried to concentrate on communities within a couple of kilometers of those mine sites because we were really concerned about the levels of contamination that resulted from the mining of asbestos in the communities. As most of you know, mines generate jobs, jobs generate communities, and when the mining companies left South Africa, as they've done in many other places around the world, they were not required to remediate their sites, they were not required to rehabilitate the mines. They made their money, they pocketed the profits, and they left the communities and the government to deal with the mess that was left behind. Now this was done, and I think very well documented by some previous work by Jock McCulloch. It was done very much with the collusion and the understanding and the wink and the nod of the apartheid government during that time. Now that they do have a democratically elected government in South Africa, they are left with this issue to try to grapple with. We went out, and the first thing we did was map where these sites were, and we looked at the communities, and what you see here is basically those green dots are the known mine sites, which is just really a fraction of the potential sources of contamination because they had not mapped adequately the dumps and the tailings piles and the little smaller mining locations that mom and pop shops had done mining asbestos over the years. But those rings then represent 1 kilometer buffers out. And we looked at the communities that were within those buffers to try to identify which ones may be at risk based on their proximity, based on where there are roads or other sites, ways of getting up to the mining locations. And we started to rank those sites from a risk standpoint just so that we could narrow down where we went out and did our environmental sampling. Then I put together a sampling team comprised of members of the communities that were lived in the areas that were being affected by asbestos. And these were folks here that were representing the asbestos interest group. They were already active in community activism to try to identify the levels of contamination in their communities. And they worked with me throughout this process for about 18 months, and I couldn't have done this work without their help. You'll see here we were looking at the maps. I was getting their feedback to find out where we really should target our surveys because I didn't have enough money and time to go out and survey everything. We had to target our research to the areas where we most suspected contamination to be. Each team had a handheld GPS so they could go out and as they collected samples and conducted interviews, they could map, collect the coordinates on the location so that we could map them using GIS. This is just some sample training where I trained them on proper techniques to collect samples and fitted them with some sample pumps so that I could assure that they were not exceeding any standards, health and safety standards while they were collecting samples. But bear in mind, these people all live in these communities as well, and this is just a group for, can you pick me out in the crowd? It's a little hard to tell. But this is just some pictures of us doing our work in the communities. Once we came up with that short list of communities, we went out and physically sampled the soil and the building materials in each location in areas that we thought were representative of the type of communities that were there. We didn't go house to house, door to door collecting our samples. We tried to pick representative locations that were homogeneous and then collected samples from each of those. But typically we would collect about 8 or 10 samples, bulk samples from each location. This is a friend of mine, Saul Bosch, who really wanted to come to this conference this year and couldn't make it. Hopefully next year we'll get some folks over. Collecting a soil sample. Here he's gently bashing someone's house with a rock to take a sample of plaster. And I don't know if you can see this color of the soil here, but it's blue. And if you know about crucidolite, the other word for it is blue asbestos. And that's the reason that soil is so blue. I didn't need to take a sample of that. We just kind of left that one alone. In essence, we focused in 2 different areas of the country. We did 37 communities on one side and 12 on the other. I won't read you all the statistics there, but gives you an idea of the samples that we collected. The only area we didn't do a lot of sampling in is where Marianne Felix had done her surveys previously, because she already had a fairly accurate database for that area, and we were able to utilize those results, though we did go and replicate a few locations just to confirm her results. These are the results of the work that we did based on the levels of contamination we found in the communities. Now, I don't want you to extrapolate these numbers directly across the board and say 82% of all the homes in South Africa are contaminated, because that wouldn't be accurate. We went out and specifically looked for areas that we thought were contaminated. So they're targeted results. They're not randomized, statistically valid samples in that regard, but they are appropriate because we were looking for the contamination that we might find. So as these numbers represent, and I won't read through them, we found very, very high levels, high rates of contamination looking at the soil and the building materials in these communities. And the reasons for that is because, as most of us know, and I don't want to be quoted out of context here, but asbestos makes a very good building material, okay, if it weren't for the fact that it will kill you. The material was readily available, it was free, it was given away by the companies, the employees were allowed to use it. It really just became a matter of whether they wanted to go up there and get it by the donkey cart load or the truckload or ever how it suit them to use the material. But they covered it in their yards, and that's not a freshly done garden or yard there. That's actually the way things are in the Northern Cape throughout much of northern part of South Africa, because it's a very arid climate. So we don't have grass and lawns, and you can imagine the dusty conditions that would occur in these kinds of locations where it's basically just bare soil. And in order to keep your yard looking tidy, you go out with a broom and you sweep it so that you get all of the debris off your soil, and you keep it looking nice and free of leaves and litter and things like that, and generating copious amounts of dust. And these soil levels will typically, they may range from trace levels to up to 10, 20, 30%, up to that blue color that I showed you previously. And of course, the roads were also covered with asbestos tailings. And again, when a vehicle travels across that road, you can imagine the billowing levels of dust that hang in the atmosphere for minutes and minutes and hours after that. Many of the schools that we assessed were contaminated with asbestos as well, both from a building material standpoint as well as the soil itself. And here's kind of a lesson in best intentions. This was actually an old school site that someone said, that school site's contaminated. It's got asbestos in the building materials and the blocks. You need to tear it down. So they did. They took it apart brick by hand, and they scattered all the blocks around the site, and they pushed all the material down, and they brought in clean bricks and built on top of the school ground, leaving all of the contaminated soil and the contaminated building material for the kids to walk back and forth in every day in and out of school. And this is just an example of a sports field where the kids go out and play soccer, and the soil is grossly contaminated with asbestos fibers. We then went through a risk assessment process to try to give them an idea of what needs to be done next and what kind of exposures may they expect from this type of contamination. And we went through that GIS process with a mapping to show them where the levels of contamination were. All of our samples were put into a database, and all of this information was given to the government for their use to develop cleanup plans. And these are just some pictures. This is one of the communities we surveyed, kind of looking out where this is actually the location of the former asbestos mill. The community is just directly behind me. I just like that picture, so I included it. This is just an example of the housing that's used. And when I said earlier I would tell you about the building materials, asbestos was readily available. Most of the building material there is made on site, so you don't go to the hardware store and order your cinder blocks or bricks. You get a form and you mix your mud on site and you build your blocks directly there, and most of the time they're not heated, treated blocks. They're just sun-baked, and so they're very friable. When you walk past and brush across it, you get a layer of dust that comes off this material. It's heavily abraded by the sun and the wind and the environmental conditions, and so these conditions can be very dusty. This is just some more examples. This is again is a school. Very nice school. I mean, I can't imagine sending my kid to a school that looks like that without the asbestos contamination in the soil. That's a picture from the inside. You can see it's not exactly airtight construction, so whatever's on the outside is getting on the inside. And again, this is just an example of a lady sweeping in a contaminated area in her village, and that's some more local construction there. Again, more examples of pathways that are grossly contaminated with loose asbestos fibers. The road is contaminated with fibers. You can see the kids walking to their contaminated school site along a contaminated road on a contaminated trail to go home to a contaminated house. And that's how you live 24/7 in South Africa, at least within these communities. Again, just more examples. There we go. They love getting their picture taken. You can't can't deny that. This is just a typical example of, again, this local block making. There we go. Get my depth ray to work here. On site, you can see where they've been tracking through the soil and making their blocks. Again, just, typical home construction. And you can kind of see these big fiber bundles, which are pretty visible here to the naked eye, just walking through many of these communities. So just to include a photo by Hein Duplessis, he's a wonderful photographer who's done some photojournalism on asbestos issues in South Africa. I think we made good strides at defining the extent and the severity of contamination, of environmental contamination resulting from asbestos mining in South Africa. There were lots of places we could have looked. We didn't look down the rail lines where it was transported. We didn't look at the docks and the shipyards, though I know they're contaminated because I did that under some separate work. There's lots of other places we could have looked for environmental contamination, but budgets and time being what they are, we focused just on those communities adjacent to the former mining sites. We developed some risk assessment plans for them. I gave them fairly detailed work strategies to use on how to go about completing remediation projects, gave them cost estimates for all of that work, and then, of course, I wouldn't be a good consultant if I didn't recommend more studies to be done. So, we left them a long list of things that need to be done as well, which range from training and capacity building to of course, the actual cleanup. And what's next? Well, I actually delivered these results to the government back in June of 2006. I finished my work at that time, and since then I've been asking them to move forward with future work, but nothing has happened. The information's just been kind of shelved for the moment. So not that there aren't, I'm sure, people who would love to move forward on the process. It just hasn't made its way to the higher echelons of governmental action.